Lux Occult is part of the Green Mushroom Podcast Network.
3, 2, 4, 8, Romeo, 7, Bravo, Delta, Quebec,
Soon you'll be ashes or bones, a mere name at most, and even that is just a sound, an echo. The things we want in life are empty, stale, and trivial. Dogs snarling at each other, quarreling children, laughing and then bursting into tears a moment later. Trust, shame, justice, truth, gone from earth and only found in heaven. Why are you still here? Sensory objects are shifting and unstable, our senses dim and easily deceived, the soul itself a decoration of the blood. Fame in a world like this is worthless. And so, wait for it patiently. Annihilation or metamorphosis. And until that time comes, what? Honor and revere the gods. Treat human beings as they deserve. Be tolerant with others and strict with yourself. Remember, nothing belongs to you but your flesh and blood, and nothing else is under your control. These cheery words are brought to you from Marcus Aurelius. Hello and welcome to Lux Occult. This is a podcast where we gleefully taunt the mundane, butcher the Latin, and pretty much every other language. And we also discuss a variety of occult, esoteric, and adjacent topics. Exploring the intersections of magic, art, science, philosophy, technology, and so much more through the lens of chaos magic, this is occultism for everyone. I'm your host, Luxa Strata, and if you're hearing the sound of my voice, then that means that this show, like magic, are for you if you want them. There are a lot of different ways to be more free in the world, and using magic or making space for a spiritual or adjacent practice in your life can be one of them. As always, I do not speak for anybody but myself. Others can, will, and should disagree with me sometimes. How would we ever learn anything if we were all in agreement on all things after all the time? Anyway, unlike those who attempt to be reasonable, I will always change my opinions based on new evidence, and often do. Alright, disclaimer's over. Stoked to bring you a great conversation I had with Isa Nakazawa, host of the Stars and Stars with Isa podcast. She shares a lot of really cool perspectives about getting into astrology and how she sort of went from being a skeptic to seeing these really interesting and meaningful patterns which began to arise as she began to study this stuff. Isa talks about a few different ways that practices like astrology or tarot or even astronomy can be technologies of freedom in people's lives, as well as helping people to recognize and address things on a broader scale, perhaps socially. Isa gives some really interesting historical examples about how looking to the skies has been a means of finding freedom for people in the past, whether it's freedom of the body or freedom of the mind. She also provides some great recommendations for resources and about how to contextualize one's own nativity, horoscopes, and much more. During a break, I'll share about some of the magical work I did surrounding the recent solar eclipse, as well as a fun recording which I took during the event. I'll also give you an update about the Green Mushroom Hypho Project and get into some listener mail and shout-outs after the interview, which will include me making good on a promise to a listener about finding a way to have a talking fish on my podcast. Alright, stay tuned for that later. Although I'm a pretty introverted person and I don't use social media very much due to this, I'm not there like checking on stuff every day or anything like that, but that certainly doesn't mean that I don't want to hear from you all or anything. I'm beyond lucky to have such amazing listeners, collaborators, cohorts, co-conspirators, and whatnot. I always welcome people's thoughts, questions, comments, suggestions, or arcane revelations. You can reach me at luxoccultpod@gmail.com, or you can hit me up on Instagram at luxoccultpod. If you like the show and whatever other work I've been getting into, you can support it on Patreon. If you do so, you can take a bibliomancy break with me. There are no tiers or levels or whatever, so give as you will. Buy me a coffee is a great way to show your support with a one-time donation if you don't want to do the whole Patreon thing. Thank you so much to those of you who are already supporting the show. This support makes it possible by allowing me to cover the expenses associated with making it, thereby justifying to myself the not insignificant time I spend. I do appreciate the opportunity to be making this thing and to have the resources necessary to reach you all today. Many thanks to the support, which is making this possible. Fuck yeah. Alright, getting into it here with my guest. Isa Nakazawa is an Oakland-based writer, producer, podcaster, and astrologer. She is currently the host for Stars and Stars with Isa, a weekly podcast where she sits with the most talented artists and thinkers of our time to read them their birth chart and discuss their life's purpose. She is also the host for Transmission Studio, a bi-weekly show produced by BAVC Media, featuring candid conversation with San Francisco's independent artists. It was great talking with Isa, and I really appreciated a lot of what she has to say in our conversation. It was really cool to hear about her journey into these practices. As somebody who began as a skeptic, I can kind of relate with a lot of that, as well as with the patterns that she began to see as she began to investigate along her family lines. She also brings up some important perspectives to consider about interacting with this stuff in responsible ways, and she has some great points about ethics as well. I feel like she'd be a great person to get a reading from, because not only is she very chill, open-minded, and collaborative in her approach, but she also radiates competence, and it's obvious that she knows what she's about. She's doing some really cool work, and I'm very stoked that we were able to connect. So very excited to share our conversation with you all. I'll be back in a bit to share about some stuff I've been up to, as I said, and to share some audio capture during the recent solar eclipse. But now let's get into it. Here's my chat with Isa Nakazawa. Well, my guest today is Isa Nakazawa. How are you doing today, Isa?
I'm doing so well. I'm very, very excited to be on the show and talk with you today. So thanks so much for having me.
I'm so excited to talk with you as well. So Isa, if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about yourself and your practice and what you've got going on with the listeners and I.
Yeah, I would love to. So yeah, my name's Isa Nakazawa. I'm actually based in Oakland, even though today I'm recording from New York City and my family lives in Queens. And I am primarily right now doing astrology. I'm doing birth chart readings. I have a new podcast called Stars and Stars with Isa, where I read artists and thinkers and cultural workers, all types of people's birth chart. And you can, listen to that everywhere. It's a weekly release on Tuesdays. And it really emerged out of my client work practice. I started seeing clients around a year and a half ago. And I, wrote that. I always say self-belief requires collective action, because I had a lot of friends who kind of nudged me to take the leap from studying and researching astrology for many number of years in depth. I'm a Scorpio stellium, so there's that intensity with research and then sometimes that fixity. And so, yeah, some of my closest friends kind of nudged me to do some client work, and I really fell in love with it. And we're going to dive in a little bit more today, but I just realized how powerful it is as a tool for not just self-understanding, but more these collective explorations, generational, signatures and broader themes, as well as the deeply personal, and how those are all very much in conversation with each other. And so outside of my astro and tarot practice, I work at Bay Area Video Coalition, and I help independent filmmakers connect to resources and mentorship. Event produce programs that help community members in the Bay Area feel like they can create something today and now through the power of community. So yeah, that's kind of me in a nutshell right now in this present moment.
I love that. Fuck yeah. Could you talk a little bit more about the idea of helping people create something right now?
Yeah, I think I'm really passionate and as a producer and a person of helping people understand that there's a lot of barriers in our mind and actual material barriers to creating. And I think those things are very real. But I try and create programs that are accessible, but don't compromise the quality or the level of program instruction and design. And I want everyone to leave the programs that I create feeling like they can start today, right now with what they have. And another part of my ethos, I'm really big on how our creativity is very much strengthened through community. That community is not I think it's a buzzword now, but I don't think it's an accessory to our practice. I think it's part of our practice. And as an aside, this is my first time doing a proper podcast that's not 100% independent. I have a team. And it's been really like eye-opening and pretty amazing to see the way that I'm able to hone my practice by having really talented producers who are very invested in my growth and making sure that, yeah, like I'm getting notes and I have deadlines. And I think it's just a reminder that like the level of teamwork really like hones and sharpens my practice. So yeah, I think just I'm very passionate about making people feel like they can create and that they can create together with others.
Fuck yeah, I love that. So kind of touching back on what you had sort of mentioned earlier, this is one of the things that I'm really interested in hearing about is this idea of how one can take a practice like tarot or astrology, which is typically, applied to self-understanding and, maybe navigating one's own life, and really kind of apply that in a way where you can have a sort of like bigger sphere of influence to maybe work in your community or other things like that. And I would just love to hear some of your thoughts about ways that's shown up in your life and maybe some ideas about how people could approach doing similarly.
Yeah, at first I wanted to thank you for that frame and question. I was really excited when I got it, and it's really thoughtful. And I think I was really excited about it because it's it's a big part of my story with tarot and astrology. I was definitely very skeptical for, my early 20s and like teenage years because I was politicized quite young because of, when you're a young person, sometimes you're learning about the things that have happened to your parents or your family, and you feel very like confused and angry.
Mm.
And so I got really politically involved, and I was a community organizer quite young. And I was worried that like spiritual practices were being used or misapplied to make people kind of not take responsibility or accountability for the identities and the realities and conditions that we're forced to reckon with in these bodies in this realm. And so I was really worried about, I think what's known now as spiritual bypassing, right? Which is kind of using astrology to like either enable your own behavior or kind of using it to function as another stereotype where you either make assumptions about yourself or other people. And then as you get older, there's very like humbling experiences in your life, and there's like mystical experiences or there's just questions that I think burn in your heart and soul that don't have rational answers, whether that's grief and death or loss or just like wonderment when you see, like for me, I remember feeling like a deep sense of awe in like this mountain town, San Jose de Pacifico in Mexico. And I was just, something cracked open in me that I couldn't put language to. And encountering, shamans and different like healers and also, tarot practitioners and teachers in the United States who I felt like they were putting language to things that I had always felt, but I didn't have a vocabulary for or like a system of symbols. And I think what's really, really incredible about tarot and astrology is the symbolic nature. And this is just my personal belief, but I think one of my concerns or critiques of only doing talk therapy or verbal forms and modes of healing, which I think are extremely important. I'm a poet. Like I believe that language casts spells, but I think the reason we need these other modalities of like mythology and symbols and meaning making and the nonverbal realms is because it's harder to hide there. And also there's a lot of science now that we know that pain and a lot of emotion is stored in our body and memory. And so there's a lot of like nonverbal forces that we have to kind of like contend with and sit with and become and befriend in a way. And so as a highly verbal person, I felt like there was like a cunning way that I could hide through language. And so it was actually like in, immersive musical experiences or in spiritual experiences where I couldn't hide anymore. And I think astrology and tarot can actually be this like mystical realm or this language of secrets where we are kind of dealing, if we're open to it, we're kind of dealing in this different register where the multiple realms kind of how do you say, like they kind of collapse and blend. So I know that's not answering directly, but I just wanted to kind of context set that I really thought I really was skeptical of these practices precisely because I thought they were a little bit navel gazing and like gave.
Okay.
I just think that I was worried that they were just going to be these tools of individualism. And
Sure, yeah.
I grew up in the States. Like we already do individualism. Like
We're really into it. Yes,
yeah.
Yeah, and my background is in science, and so I have a sort of a skeptical approach, but I'm also into doing very strange things too. So it's a
what's an
interesting
example?
balance there. Well, I mean, I'm a practicing chaos magician, right? So I do all kinds of things. I've performed public or in semi-public, in kink spaces, rituals and things like, so strange things I'm up to. But I'm also, as I said, a background in science, and so I have a
Wow.
sort of experimental approach to all of this, which is grounded in that.
I love that. That's really cool. I don't have a background in either of those things, but I think that what I'm hoping to do, one of my deepest intentions with this show is to invite and encourage all of us to bring the multiple lenses to bear to our practices. So
Yes.
even though I'm doing like an astrology show, like there's astrologers that have been practicing for 30 years who are like multi-generational astrologers. That's certainly not me.
Mhm.
And so I think there's room for all of us. And I think for me, my unique take is like I bring in philosophy, I bring in science. And I always say on my show, like doubt is a big part of my practice. Like I don't and I always felt like this is where astrologers and astronomers are so similar, is that I find that both people are very curious and we're people who are like looking and studying patterns. And it's not necessarily with the hope of finding answers. It's
Mhm.
kind of like living out the questions and understanding that whether you're talking about your individual psychology or like patterns on the collective generational level, these are, things to conceptualize and problematize. They're not necessarily things to grasp and hold on to and contain and control.
Mhm.
And I think, unfortunately, in both astrology and astronomy, in the history of those two things, you will see a spectrum. Like you will see both astronomers and scientists and astrologers who've colluded with empire or
Mhm.
like with power. And you've also seen, like, one thing I always remind people is like there are so many nameless, largely like queer and women astrologers whose names we will never know because they were practicing at a time where you had to practice underground.
Mhm.
And it's so important for me to bring those ancestors into every conversation because there's the ones that have a name and have a record. And
Mhm.
then there's the ones who, unlike the time we live in right now, you can't necessarily practice publicly or you can't necessarily be rewarded for your practice through having a show or, you know what I mean? Like
Mhm. Yeah.
those are all of the legacies through which that I'm allowed to take up space in this practice right now. So I think even just thinking about how we're connected and how things aren't individual, like we really need to make sure we understand we're not practicing in these decontextualized silos. Like
Yeah.
you and I are both part of a web of a constellation of practitioners who've made it possible for us, right?
Mhm. Yeah, I love what you're saying there. And I love what you're saying too about, having doubt. I think, one of the things I always say is stay curious. And if you think you already know everything, you can't learn anything, right? So, and doubt
Truly.
is a big part of that. And yes, one of the, pitfalls of some of these practices, I think, can be that if you're not careful, they can, lead you into places that are maybe a little bit delusional or
Yeah.
not helpful in other ways. And I think that it's really healthy to have that balance there.
Yeah, I was trying to write some notes down to prepare for this, and I was thinking about this kind of dualistic place that I sit in this question. Because on the one hand, I feel like what I just said, we're inviting these other disciplines of like sociology and philosophy is important. And also one of the reasons that astrology spoke to me is through like Afrofuturism, through Octavia Butler and Sun Ra, and these people who I think for a lot of folks who feel like they're confined to their inherited identities, the stars kind of remind us that we are these like infinite, expansive creatures, and it also decenters humans, right?
Yeah.
So I think there's also these parts of astrology and folklore and mythology that can be a technology of freedom for so many people who feel like all they're ever allowed to be are these like discrete identities that come with a lot of pain, and so
Mm.
I think science fiction too, like any of these technologies that allow us to dream beyond the mundane, I think they're potentially very dangerous, but I also do think there's a role for that kind of dreaming and that kind of projection of like who we always have been outside of the very real identities that we have to also, I think for me, I'm just saying, speaking for me, we also have to kind of contribute and factor into our practice.
Mhm.
But it's this, I don't know if you feel what I'm saying, but it's like this contraction in my practice all the time between making room for like our animal bodies that are maneuvering a very real world, a very materially informed world, and then this other part of us that I always want to protect, like the part of us that can dance with the intangible and feel permission, feel permission to say, I am not only am I a reflection of the cosmos, but like my bones are made up of the same stuff, So I think it's always this like both and for me of like, we need to be really mindful and careful and discerning, but we also need to let the stars work on us, if that makes sense, and not always bring like a very hyper rational lens to these practices, because I don't think they're compatible all the time. I don't know how you feel about that with like managing chaos magic and science, but sometimes you have to let the language you're working in speak to you. You can't always control it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think there's a lot of wisdom in what you're saying there for sure. I think there's a lot of different sort of like modes of knowing, perhaps, or like,
Mm.
and they're not always, you can't always do them at once. And each one is interesting to sort of like look through, but in order to get the whole picture, you really have to be able to shift through those things and try to look through these multiple lenses.
Yes, I love that, modes of knowing. And I think there was a way in which my public school education had very much encouraged this one type of knowing,
Mm.
which is like, I always kind of describe it as you wield knowledge like a defense system or as like something to show off.
Hmm.
And when I went to Wesleyan University, and it was like an incredible school that changed my life. It's a liberal arts college, but I feel like, we were definitely encouraged to, I would say, perform a certain level of knowledge. And I think when I got older, I realized that knowledge is it's not necessarily something you perform, and I think that the tarot, I want to shout out one of the people who like changed everything for me, which was Jessica Dorr, who actually has a book called Tarot for Social Change. And her practice is just so beautiful and so informed by all these different like lenses. And I took a couple of her workshops, and I just felt like she was putting language to like all of the skepticism that I had, but showing me how being skeptical doesn't mean you don't enter it and you
Hmm.
don't create your own kind of version of the practice. And she's someone who is really a believer in like astrology as kind of, as tarot as kind of a way to name the world. Yeah, I feel like there's so many teachers that showed me that I can be in these spaces and be my full self, bring in my critical lens, because she always is asking us to be critical of these old school canonical texts of tarot and like what are the assumptions in the interpretations, and make sure that we feel agency to question them. So like
Hmm.
obviously a lot of astrology and tarot is gendered.
Hmm.
And there's also a lot of assumptions about like light as right and dark
Hmm.
as wrong. So
Hmm.
she's trying to get people to be engaged in your practice, be awake, like don't go to practices so vulnerable that you're just looking for, a God or an answer or certainty, because that puts you in, like you said, a very vulnerable situation that's where I think the delusion comes in, is that sometimes we come to these practices so desperate. And I'm not judging that, right? That's
Hmm.
super real. Like,
Yeah.
I know for me, when I kind of stopped doing tarot readings because it freaked me out a little bit, because people were coming to me and they were like, should I move? Should I break up? Should I? And I'm like, oh my gosh, like
It's a
this
lot of
is,
responsibility here, y'all. Yeah, for sure.
it's a lot of responsibility. It's also like, wow, you're really surrendering your agency. Like,
Mhm.
and I think for me, I on my website, I have very explicit language when I always do a consultation call before saying yes to a client, so that I make sure they know I'm not a predictive astrologer. I'm not a predictive tarot divination worker. Like, I'm all about collaborative meaning making and guiding with questions and curiosity. And so for me, I'm not the right reader. Like, if
Mhm.
you want someone who's going to tell you your future, there are people for that. But for me, it's like there's a lot of ethical questions that go into these practices. And yeah, if someone's like, should I break up should I divorce my partner? I'm like, I mean, come on. Like,
Yeah,
I want to do
yeah.
like stand up about that. Like, I just imagine the cosmos being like, all right, y'all, like you're wilding. That's, I feel like that's always something that really worries me about people using these practices to kind of take over and do the work for people. And I think there's a really big difference between asking the cards for an answer because you're too afraid to make it versus using them as like prompts. Like,
Yeah.
what if the cards are prompts? What if they're helping you unstick? What if they're offering a different perspective? What if they're increasing your compassion because you're asking a question about your partner that you're mad at, and the card actually illuminates maybe a blind spot of yours.
Mm-hmm.
Like that is to me the beauty of it. I think where I don't like using tarot and astrology is like when you're kind of codependent with it and you become so afraid of living life because you're at the whim of the transits or of the card, you know? And so I think, yeah, for anyone who's listening, like I would be really careful with using any form of divination as a stand-in for your own work.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's a really important point to make for sure.
Yeah, and I think, did you see that Netflix documentary on Walter Mercado, the Puerto Rican astrologer?
I have not seen it yet.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I adore him, and I think he was a really complicated figure because a lot of the horoscopes that he would do, spoke to the most vulnerable folks, like people whose conditions are such that like any good news, any news of like luck coming their way is, a very desired blessing. And so I think seeing that documentary, it really made me like, and I'm already someone who thinks a lot about the ethics of these things, but I thought it did a good job of like shining a light on that. And I also think it's complicated for me. Like, I think it also brought a lot of joy, right? And like, even if it's like you said, even if it's delusional, I think it brought people a sense of possibility maybe on a Wednesday where they almost couldn't get through the day. So I think it's a little bit complicated for me, but I definitely hope that most practicing astrologers who are professional have some sort of like open ethical conversation with themselves.
I love that. Yeah, thank you. I do appreciate what you're saying a lot. And I was just going to say that, there could be a sort of semantical line to dance between hope and delusion, perhaps, right? In terms of how
I'm dancing on it. Fully there.
Going back over this and doing the editing, I was thinking we might all be dancing on the line between hope and delusion. This is sometimes necessary, and there are some semantic liminalities between these two, of course, which are interesting to consider. Greetings, it's me, Luxa from the future. Hope you're enjoying my chat with Isa Nakazawa so far. I really appreciate a lot of what she has to say in this one, and it only gets better from here. We're going to be hearing more of Isa soon, including the differences between the outer and personal planets, looking at one's own birth chart, and more. But first, I wanted to share a fun tidbit about the recent solar eclipse, as well as to share about some of the magical work that I've been doing and did surrounding it. In this episode, we are, after all, talking about looking up with practices like astrology and more. I also thought it might be useful to provide this example of what I'm up to for people who are interested in doing work surrounding identity or exploring areas of their life that they are afraid to go, or however you want to think about it. So much of what we choose to do or what we think we're capable of can revolve around the stories that we tell about who we are to ourselves. A lot of this narrative comes from external sources, of course, and there can be a lot of variation in terms of how this plays out for us based on a variety of like social, economic, and all kinds of other factors, right? It's going to be completely context dependent. But a lot of times we end up internalizing a lot of this narrative just as a part of a learning process as social creatures, having to do with where we fit into the landscape of the world or whatever. And we kind of take it inside and make it our own without realizing that we're doing it. And this becomes the basis for our ideas about who we are and therefore what we're capable of or allowed to do or things along those lines. This is super complicated, and to be addressing the sort of like really nuanced things that I'm going to be talking about here today is absolutely a position of privilege to be in. This is going to look, different for everybody in application depending on what their life is like. But I suspect that there might be a sort of like basic kernel or formula here which can be extracted and used in a variety of different situations. Aidan Wachter breaks this idea down really well in his book, Weaving Fate. But it's sort of this. In order to do the things that you want to do but aren't doing yet, you need to become the type of person who does those things. There's also some pretty good stuff about this in Topi's The Psychic Bible as well. A sort of cultivation of qualities through action would perhaps be another way of thinking about this. I've been doing work surrounding identity for quite a while. This is nothing like new, but for this particular instance, leading up to the eclipse on April 8th, there was a few big things that I was working on. I had had a sort of significant birthday and some big changes in my life and all of that stuff, and much of it centered on death and rebirth. Good time of year for it, of course. And moving into more avenues for expression, finding more of my voice, perhaps. One of the reasons I started making this show was to create a space where I felt like my voice could be heard, where people would listen without talking over or interrupting me, which used to happen a lot, but doesn't so much anymore. I've learned to get louder. And if this is resonating with you, I hope that you will learn to get louder as well. People often seem surprised to hear this, but I'm a pretty shy person, just generally speaking, who sometimes has to fight against a lot of social anxiety to do the things that I do. It's worth it, because these are the things that I want to do, but it takes some extra effort and discipline sometimes. Magical practice is very helpful for cultivating things like discipline and for helping you to look at the big picture and things like that. Ritual and adjacent concepts can play in important ways with some of our psychological infrastructure as humans. It's pretty well understood. When we use this knowledge intentionally, under our own auspices, in ways which increase our agency, it can be really powerful. It's sort of one of the main tenets of a lot of people's magical practices. Anyway, one thing that I'm going to be doing as part of my ongoing work is to learn how to sing. I've always wanted to. I've just been too nervous, and I've just recently worked myself up to it. I feel like a practice involving breath and voice that I can come to every day, something that's also physical, I think it'll be something really cool to explore. I'm really excited about it. I was able to schedule my first singing lesson to take place right after the eclipse happened. I'd been imagining it as a time for a sort of like new version of myself to climb forth from the void, to emerge from the portal that would open with the eclipse, perhaps. It seems fitting that the first thing this new creature who was me would do would be to fulfill one of the purposes it would be called forth to do. I'm of course speaking allegorically here, please don't take what I'm saying too literally. But when I met my teacher, I was delighted to learn that she was also interested in esoterica and the like, and she totally got the identity magic experiment I was conducting when I explained it to her, which is exciting. I almost missed my singing lesson, though, because before the eclipse started, I got a sort of overwhelming urge to go work out with my steel mace. Shout out to Fourth Dimension Fitness, by the way. So it's super fun, but I don't usually get this type of, overwhelming urge to go, work out with it. But this felt important. And because, at the time I'd been in the midst of doing some, days-long, pretty heavy magical stuff, I felt particularly keen to trust in those little hints and instincts. I was planning to go to the park, but I instead found myself walking down to the swimming pool where there are some big windows that act like mirrors, which are pretty handy. When I got down there, one of my neighbors, who I learned was named Kathy, was hanging out and watching the eclipse, and we got to talking. She ended up telling me a few things that wound up being very useful, things I needed to hear and sort of information I needed to find at that time in order to understand some of what had been going on with myself in my life. It was one of those sort of crossroads meetings, it felt like. I can't recall ever seeing Kathy before or since. I'm somewhat oblivious, though. Apologies, Kathy, if you see me. But I do very much appreciate having spent the eclipse with someone who is also looking up. I wanted to capture some of the experience of that afternoon and to pass along some of what Kathy had to say to you all. The audio quality is not great. As I said, I was not really planning to go out and do recording. I was planning to go work out with my steel mace, but if you all like this idea of me going out and taking these, field recordings or whatever, let me know, and maybe I can figure out a way to get some better quality going on there. Alright, hope you enjoy. Alright, this is Luxa. I'm here down by the pool, and one of my neighbors is here with me and is sharing some thoughts about the eclipse. Would you mind saying your name or whatever name you want them to hear?
Yeah, my name's Kathy.
Kathy, awesome. So you're telling me about your family and how that's affected, your philosophy in terms of photography and all of
Absolutely.
that.
Absolutely. This is an opportunity that everyone in the world looks up when we have spent the last many years looking down at our cell phones, at our whatever, right?
Yeah.
And my dad was a pilot. He looked up. He flew in those skies.
My father-in-law's a pilot.
Is he
Retired
really?
pilot, yeah.
Is he really?
Yeah.
It's the view from there is amazing, and your philosophy changes the higher that you go. When I was a motivational speaker, I asked my guys to please look up. Stop looking down. That's stuff that's already happened. Look up for things that you can do, that you are potentially able to do and aid and abet. You are the person who can make stuff happen. And it seemed to really work. My philosophy, I'm retired now, but for 30 years I've grown really strong people, and they have grown other strong people, and that is my legacy. That is the really cool thing. Today we're watching an eclipse, and the cool thing about this eclipse is that it's spiritual. You don't even realize how spiritual it is, but it's moving. It won't happen again for 20 years. I won't be here. You will be here. I will not be here. But in any case, it's an amazing thing where everybody in the world can hold hands and say, wow, that is a cool moment.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you sharing your thoughts. All right, thanks so much to Kathy for allowing me to capture her thoughts and to share them with you, and also for the advice and the book recommendation. I hope that you are well should you happen to hear this. Since we're on the topic of the eclipse and I'd been mentioning my magical work, I did want to say that part of the stuff that I've been doing with the singing lessons is some of what I'm looking at as being sort of ancestor work with somebody I consider as a spiritual ancestor, David Bowie. It's obviously a super complex, troubled, and problematic person who was also an incredible inspiration and a real magical visionary in terms of what he was able to deliver into the world and the way he was able to explore identity so meaningfully through his work. I wanted to say thank you so much to Lavender Laura for organizing some very fun chats surrounding the eclipse, which were hosted on the Green Machine Discord server. She really offered a great spread. We had astronomy, zoology, aka fun animal genitalia facts, history, original theater, poetry, and a whole lot of Bowie strangeness. Fuck yeah. You can see some images of my eclipse work, including a weird cut-up video I made, and me wearing the iconic lightning bolt makeup on my Instagram at Lux Occult Pod. I also wanted to give a shout out to Keats Ross over at wethehollow.org. I've been using my copy of the Divergent Magic Grimoire to organize some of this work that I've been doing, and I'm really loving how he has things set up in there. You can find the Divergent Magic Anarchic Grimoire for ritual creation, ruination, and rebirth at wethehollow.org. I will put a link to that in the show notes. Alright, we're going to be getting back into the rest of my conversation with Isa Nakazawa in just a moment here. Really excited to share the rest of this one with you all. Isa offers some really great examples from history, as I mentioned, and we talk a little bit about our own birth charts too. The idea of what people are calling spiritual bypassing came up earlier, which is, if I understand correctly, when people use practices like astrology or magic or tarot or meditation or yoga or whatever it is, to avoid doing the work of resolving the sources of the problems they might be having, and instead use spiritual practice as a means of coping in ways which are maybe not super helpful or super healthy in the long run. I think state chasing, where you're doing operations more for the rush or feeling of it and not considering other important factors carefully, might have some adjacencies with this concept, as well as being another potential pitfall to, try to sidestep on one's magical journey or spiritual path. Matt from over at chaostarot.com has written an article about the stages of grief and how, as magicians, it might be tempting to get caught up in the bargaining phase. It's really interesting stuff, and I appreciate the perspectives that he offers in there. I'll put a link to it in the show notes in case you'd like to check that out. I'd also be curious to hear people's thoughts about grief and magic, spiritual bypassing, or if anything crazy happened for you during the eclipse. You can reach me at luxoccultpod@gmail.com or find me at luxoccultpod on Instagram. Alright, as I said, stoked for you to hear the rest of my chat with Isa Nakazawa, the talented host of Stars and Stars with Isa. I will be back later to do listener mail and shoutouts, in which I address a question surrounding atheism and whether or not it's a spiritual path, which came up for somebody in the last episode. I'll also give you an update about the Green Mushroom Project and more. But for now, let's hop back in for more of my chat with Isa Nakazawa. Hey, it's Luxa from the Lux Occult podcast. I want to tell you about a new update to the trinary sigil generator at chaostarot.com. The bulk of this update was for normie shit like design, navigation, logic, and user experience, which was long overdue, I'm told. Each tool has a new About page in case the tech is new to you. You'll also notice each tool has its own URL now, so you can link to exactly what you want. There are also options for dark mode, left-handed navigation, and accessibility font for dyslexia. Cheers! Some of the existing tools got feature updates along the same lines, with new options for tarot and runes, a mobile-friendly word method, full steps for all the rituals, and some background images for your sigils. Also, all the random elements have been updated to use the Mercenary Twister algorithm. Now, it wouldn't be an update without adding a few new tools, so in keeping with the normie theme, most of them involve subverting more common concepts for use in occult workings. We've got playing cards, a coin toss, a magic 8-ball, dice rollers, dice divination, a lotto picker, keyboard sigils, Morse code, Braille, NATO phonetic, sign language, Zener cards, Android Dreams Tarot, the 8-circuit model of consciousness, and also in the mix is the Green Mushroom Project Statement of Resistance. So that's just the new stuff. Trinary has a bunch of other tools as well that I use all the time. Go and check it out. It's a fun and free way to fuck around and find out.
Hey Luxa, what do you have there? It looks like a tattered old Discord server.
Oh, this old thing? It's pretty beat up. But if I do this...
Sweet! Now that you peeled off the outer bits, it looks fresh as hell.
We should call it the Green Machine.
Awesome! I fucking hate it!
That's okay. It should function alright, but it would probably work better if we had more people.
Yeah, we have an awesome crew of chaots, occultists, socialists, witches, and weirdos, but there's always room for more.
Absolutely. If you'd like to take part in any of our many chats, rituals, workshops, clubs, and more, hit me up and I will send you a link. You can reach me at luxoccultpod@gmail.com or at luxoccultpod on Instagram.
And remember, resist.
So I'm curious, in your study of astrology, has there been something that's, or some things, or anything like that that's like been really surprising, or that has really kind of like shifted the way that you've looked at the world or seen yourself?
Yeah, so many. I'm trying to think of like which ones. I mean, I think so. First of all, I always encourage folks, we're all such different learners, first of all, but I took my time with astrology. For those of you who are, for more advanced folks, but for beginners, I think when you start scratching the surface, you're like, oh, this is chill, like the big three, but then you really go in depth. And like, for example, this is just to ground it in something specific. At a certain point in your research, you realize there's a difference between like the personal planets and the outer planets. And even that alone was like something that made me way more interested in astrology, because the inner planets have a lot more to do with like your inner psychology, and the outer planets are, so for example, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. Like Pluto takes 11 to 32 years to transition signs, or like Uranus is 7 years, Neptune's 14. So these are kind of these generational patterns that you'll see themes and questions that shape an entire generation. And so that really drew me in, because I was like, oh, so it's so much more complex than just like this roadmap to my inner psyche. And actually what's fascinating too is that there's 12 astrological houses in our birth chart, and only the first house deals explicitly with the self. And the rest of the houses contain everything else, from like ancestral inheritance to collaborators and relationships. So I started to realize, wow, astrology is encompassing of all these multitudes. And that really made me super interested. And so the first thing I did was I asked my parents how many birth times we know, which I want to do a video on how I think it's a privilege to have a birth time. There's so many people who don't have one. And so how do we accommodate that? And, there's so many amazing astrologers that talk about this. Like, I think it's a community that's very, aware. But I think it's important to always say, like, it is a privilege. And they did some work for me. And like, we found the birth times for my parents and their parents. And I started to notice all of the different patterns that would show up across generation in signs and placements, aspects and signatures. And it started to almost read as like Morse code or like 1001, and so, and at the same time, I was getting really into mycelium and mushrooms. And I was getting really I've always been really big into music and like, sheet music, musical notation. And I started to see all of the ways these languages are kind of mimicking each other or like or confirming each other, that there is this kind of notion of genetic memory, or that there are ways that things pass on through us, whether or not we like are connected to our biological family members. There's this kind of like encoded map that exists within us that's mirrored in the cosmos, or that's mirrored in a tree, or that's mirrored in a piece of music. And so that was really surprising, that there was such a vast and yet specific kind of vocabulary to astrology, whereas I had gone my whole life thinking of astrology more as like horoscopes, or I'm just a Scorpio sun. Like I didn't really understand. And now that I'm doing this show, like a lot of people think of astrology just as horoscopes and their sun sign.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think just scratching the surface quickly, put me on to all of the complexity that exists in our chart. And then as like a Scorpio Mercury, I'm just like, from there on, I was just kind of hooked and Chris Brennan, who's one of the biggest inspirations for my practice, has this video on the astrology podcast. You can check it out, where he interviews someone who's a skeptic. And I forget the name of the episode, but it's like a whole 2-hour conversation about why Chris Brennan is a believer. And he said something that I thought resonated so deeply, where he was like, I think people assume that I wanted astrology to work. And I was like, oh my God, I hella relate to that. Like, it's not like you're trying to, for me at least, it wasn't like I wanted it to work or that I wanted to believe it. In fact, it was really kind of embarrassing for a long time for me. And so I think when you do your own research and you actually let your doubt be part of it, but not lead, I think that was when I started, becoming more invested, because I was like, I'm literally seeing these patterns. Like Aquarius, everyone in my family has an Aquarius sun, and then my generation breaks that, but we all have major dominant Aquarius placements in our chart. And then now my sister just had 2 kids and they're Aquarius rising. So you just see the kind of through line and the permutations of the same like celestial energy being shuffled and rearranged. And so I think there's a lot of assumptions that astrologers wake up and like want to be an astrologer. And it's like, I don't know about that. That wasn't my journey. I certainly fought it, but y'all do your research. What's that phrase? Like, don't believe me. Go do your own.
Do your own
research and holler at me. Let me know what you find. But I feel like it's a constant surprise. It's a constant learning, and I'm trying to think of another one. But yeah, those 2 stood out.
Yeah, I love what you're saying there. I'm not an astrologer per se, but I've definitely had this happen in like other areas of my practice, where you kind of see these patterns open up to you, and it's like, oh wow, I'm sort of looking at a whole new order of magnitude here, and like, am I crazy? And like, you're sort of double checking your work, and you're like, wait, no, this is actually like, seems like it's so yeah, I can relate to what you're saying there. Very cool.
Yeah, and I feel like on a more basic level, learning, there's something revelatory about learning your rising sign. And I think it's been one of the many joys of this show is hearing artists in real time respond to their moon and their rising when they've only known their sun. And especially when you're giving them the context of the houses and they're kind of unlocking in front of you. Not that they're like, it doesn't mean that they're believing, but that as a total stranger, I'm asking them very specific questions about their life that, again, it's not about whether it's real or not, true or not. It's so generative, and that to me is already such a generous part of what astrology can offer, which is, I find that as someone who's not great at small talk, astrology and science for that matter are these like shared vocabularies and shortcuts to bring people into more meaningful discussion fast. Right. And I actually don't think it requires that we agree or that we both believe. Like, it's literally just a framework. It's a prompt, and science is like that for me too. I don't feel knowledgeable particularly about science, but I just love it. And like when someone's talking to me about something you're passionate about, I feel like it's so generous and it just gives me something to jump off of and understand myself through and yeah, push back against. And I always say like take what resonates and leave the rest. Like you should again always feel like an active participant in any reading. And if someone is making you feel like they know more about you than you do, like question that. Like,
Absolutely. Yeah,
right? I feel like
absolutely.
and
What's
don't
actually going
and
on
jump in.
there, because what I've seen happen sometimes in, these kinds of spaces is what I would describe as like maybe power being played with in maybe non-consensual ways. And I think that would be like an example of that, that sort of boundary there when you're like walking up to it. And it's like, why are you trying to like trick me into like thinking that you have this power over me or whatever it is? So yeah.
I'm curious how you navigate that because I feel like anytime people hear the word magic, there's kind of a register of fear, you know? So I'm like one of the phrases I've been playing with is like mundane magic or like how do you make magic something that kind of retains its power and its mystery but also kind of demystifies it in the same sense.
Well, I guess so. For effective communication, I always try to sort of like take into context like the person who I'm speaking to. So for people who
Yeah.
don't have like a lot of grounding in, spirituality or woo type of thing, occulty type things, I might describe a lot of what I do in my practice as psychological tools for self-development, perhaps, or,
Mm.
things like that. I think it's the case that as humans, there's a lot of psychological infrastructure surrounding ritual and other things that we can use in intentional ways to make structure in our life or, build scaffolding for projects that we want to accomplish or other things like that. So this is the sort of mundane way that I would describe it. To somebody that was really maybe spiritual and had, a relationship with angels or demons or whatever they've got going on, fairies, who knows, right? Whatever people are into, I would probably describe it in a much different way, using that context that, you can have these things help you with the things that you want to have happen or, just in chaos magic, we have something called the models of magic, which is like these different ways
Mm.
of looking at magic. Like magic works, but why? Okay, well, the psychology model is like, okay, it's all in your head, but your head might be like bigger than you realize. Lon Milo DuQuette said
Oh.
that. The spirit model, as I mentioned, there's these external agents. The energy model, perhaps it's like, energies, some properties of physics or something like that.
Mm.
Um, we've got the information model, perhaps it's kind of like a simulation hypothesis thing, and we can toy around with the code of reality or whatnot. And then
Mm.
there's the idea of the meta model that is the approach I usually take, which it's like, well, this is a sort of territory. All of these things are maps for a territory that we can't actually visit. These are all just approximations and stuff. So whatever lens makes the most sense to you to look through at the time would be the approach I would take. So yeah, hopefully that answers your
Oh my gosh, I
question.
love that. My brain is tickling.
Right
Like,
on. And
ooh,
I
I
love
love
what you
that.
said about astrology too, because it's actually sort of very similar to a point that I've made about it to people, even people who are skeptics, even if somebody doesn't feel like there's any causal relationship at all between what
Mhm.
goes on up there and what goes on down here or whatever, even if that's the case, I do think it still offers a really rich vocabulary of, ways of talking about aspects of your personality that are sort of hard to like nail down and stuff otherwise. And it really allows for conversations in which people can get to know each other in ways that can build, healthy intimacy and things like that. I think it's cool for that reason for sure.
Yeah, and I love so much of what you said, but I also love being like process and context driven. And I think for me in the past and still now, I often find that when someone gets too overwhelmed with astrology, because there can be a lot of information and it can feel like an overload for people or they get oversaturated. And I really like to read at the rate of comprehension. Like if you're starting to explain something and someone's glazed over, it's not registering for them. Like, why are you continuing? Like,
Yeah.
again, like it shouldn't be about flexing your knowledge. It should be about, you're co-creating an experience. I have found that tarot can be a really great like entree because it's imagery. And I
Mhm.
find that people there's just something very accessible about tarot because it's storytelling, and people look at the images, and there's so many amazing different kinds of art and decks and symbolism. But I find that one I've used a lot for people who are like not astrology might be like too big of a leap for them. But I think there's something quite universal about like storytelling and symbols as like a prompt for our imagination. And I find that people can like kind of immediately jump into an interpretation, and they don't need to know, quote unquote, the right interpretation or what it's supposed to mean. And I actually think kind of like forcefully imposing that onto someone, who's to say that like what they are interpreting couldn't expand, right? Like how we've thought of the strength card or the hermit card. So, and that's another thing I've been surprised by is the way that in my client work or on the show, someone who's like, I know nothing about astrology, the way they like bring these incredibly poetic, spontaneous interpretations to their sun sign or their aspects or a card. I just find that like extemporaneous ability to respond and interpret so life-giving and exciting. I was like, you don't need to even know this stuff to be able to jump right in and, kind of lead. And so I think like, again, I think a good teacher kind of helps you walk yourself to your own power, and you leave not even thinking about them necessarily. It's like you kind of just feel more closer to yourself. But one thing I did want to say is I've been thinking a lot, and I'm curious how this sits with you, but I've been also thinking about how these tools right now are so helpful for me because they actually challenge the culture of over optimizing, because I don't feel like the cosmos are just interested in self-development or growth. Like I always laugh when like dudes are just always about growth mindset. I'm like, and I think I'm not trying to laugh to be an asshole, but I think that there's so many, cues in nature about like the role of decomposition and dying and, regeneration. And I think that astrology has all these like archetypal and mythological significations and stories that are also about finding gratitude and meaning in all of it. And it doesn't privilege one state. So even one of my favorite cards in the tarot is the Wheel of Fortune, because it's so often misread and like people pull it and they're like, yeah, fortune.
You're like, wait, not so fast.
Yeah, wait. Like, because I feel like there's so many good memes about like when you get like 7 of swords, 5 of swords, 3 of swords, and you're like, God damn. But then sometimes you get all the happy cards, and I feel like you're kind of not being critical of what it could mean. And for me, the Wheel of Fortune is this reminder that if you're in a moment where you feel abundant and you feel like joyful, embrace it and receive it and enjoy it, because everything's temporary. So like the wheel continues to turn, and it's really for me a card of like embracing the ebb and flow and understanding that all of these pieces speak to each other. And for me, it's actually about not over privileging one state. But it's funny how it's read. It's just like, hell yeah. Which I'm not mad at. I think that's great. But I think it's great. Sometimes you need that card because everything in your life feels slow and stuck. And it's a reminder that it won't be forever. And then I think sometimes you can start getting attached to things working out, right? And being in a place of abundance. And that card is like, and this wheel is going down. So I feel like, I think one of the other things that I'm learning from these practices is not to privilege one emotion, not to overvalue one kind of state of being, or like you said earlier, mode of knowing or way of knowing. And I think that's big in our culture. Like we're super encouraged to overvalue certain emotions and fear others. And hopefully these practices can kind of demystify some of that fear, or at least invite us to look closer at it. And what better way to do that than collectively? Like, I think when you're doing these things, again, in isolation, that's cool too. But I really would, invite and encourage folks to find other friends or find readers you trust, because there's really nothing better. There's no substitute for the kind of collaborative nature of making meaning with other people and hearing how like you interpret something, or how you would expand my definition of Scorpio. So I just feel like our practices are so enriched through kind of, I know I keep saying the word community. It's a big one for me, but yeah, through the right community.
Yeah, right on. Well, I love this. I'm just kind of what you're saying, touching on this. I have a Discord community that with my friends organize, and we had an event called Divination Potluck the other night where people brought
Oh.
their divination systems and we hung out, and we actually did play a collaborative storytelling game as part of this with our divination tools. Each person would draw a Lenormand card or a tarot card or whatever, thing that they had brought, and we told this kind of little story with what resulted there. And so that's just an example of ways people can just kind of like do this for fun without even, needing to have like a magical outcome or a point or like any kind of like real organized structure around it. You can just kind of, fuck around and find out. So, yeah, I love what you're saying there. That's so cool.
Yeah, and I think that's so helpful to be reminded of. I think for me, what's interesting is that my astrology practice was something that I would do after work, and really wasn't telling anyone about it. Only a couple friends knew, and there was nothing transactional about it, and there was no outcome about it. It was just something that I was researching and practicing and finding for years at a very like slow pace. And now it's becoming this like vehicle of abundance in my life. And I share that to say, sometimes I think when we're too, again, growth mindset, goal it out, like you're kind of suffocating.
Achieve, yes.
Achieve. Yeah. Like I think if I had done that with astrology, I just would have suffocated it. And I really think that in a way, it makes total sense that this has been such a generative like vehicle for my life, because it's not something that I suffocated or controlled. It was actually this thing that I had no intention of professionalizing. And I wonder sometimes if that allows us to fully surrender to our curiosity and let it just kind of reveal itself over time, like which can be 8 years, 10 years. But I think sometimes we feel such a rush to professionalize and create very concrete goals, which I'm not saying are a bad thing, but I just think that learning takes a lifetime. And I would say specifically astrology and tarot, there's so many layers. I think finding the right teachers, letting yourself, kind of first dig into your own birth chart and your own kind of relationship to the symbols. Like I want to say I spent a month, maybe more, with one card, because I felt like there was something very strange about constantly pulling cards. Like it just felt weird to me. And I felt like I was gamifying spirituality. And so I tried to sit with one card for a really long time, just to like almost exhaust it. Like, what is it? What am I confused about? What assumptions am I not investigating enough? Like all of those things. And I would seek out workshops about stuff. So I just think that has really bolstered and strengthened my practice now, where like I can pull from more of like a rich reservoir of philosophy and different teachers, because again, I took my time and I wasn't trying to like immediately make it a thing. Like, okay, I need a podcast tonight. So, which I'm not trying to say there's a right way or wrong way to do it, but I just think, to your point, it's really nice sometimes to just allow yourself to fuck around and find out. And yeah, and then sometimes it just leads to stuff,
Yeah, I love that. So I'm curious, if listeners are hearing this and they're saying, man, this astrology stuff, this tarot stuff, this sounds very cool. How would you recommend people start approaching these practices?
Yeah, I love that question. I've been getting it a lot recently. I really love Chani Nicholas's book. I think that she made something that is like it's like a dual. It's called You Were Born for This. And it's kind of like a crash course but it's really thoughtful. I don't feel like it's not like dumbed down or anything, but it kind of goes through the like what each placement means, the houses, some aspect stuff, but it's also kind of half workbook. And one of the books that I probably wouldn't recommend if you don't want to get like deep into it is this Demetra George book, Ancient Astrology. But one thing that book has in common is that every section there's like a quiz. And I just think that's so helpful. When you're trying to get into something, it's helpful to check for your comprehension. So those two books I think are great. And the astrology podcast is so good. Like they do monthlies where they kind of help you understand the forecast. I think, horoscopes can be interesting. I really like Susan Miller's horoscopes at Astrology Zone. I would just, if you do have a birth chart or a birth time, I would read for your rising. Because your rising orients your chart. And so the houses are inaccurate if you're doing your sun sign. And I would always this is my personal kind of bias, but I like starting with the tarot cards that are like universal and then finding the decks off of that. And so there's the Rider-Waite is the kind of canonical deck. And it's problematic and like Eurocentric and all these things, but I think it helps you I don't know if anyone's listened to my podcast, but I talk a lot about Aquarius. I use the metaphor of like a free jazz improviser who learns the scales to forget the scales, like a la John Coltrane. Yeah.
Aquarius loves to fuck shit up, but in like a good way, you know?
And like we got Saturn and Uranus. I'm Aquarius Mars, but I really operate that way where it's like I'm gonna like start with Rider-Waite and I'm never gonna end there, but it's helpful for me to learn so that I can then bring to bear my own kind of critical lens. And if that doesn't resonate, like there's so many amazing, there's honestly like infinite, incredible. Yeah, there's one that I love recently, the Trickster's Journey Tarot deck by Jia Sung. So there's a lot of really incredible decks that you can find and research that may speak specifically to you. And I feel like I would just not overthink it. Like look at decks, see if you connect with the imagery. When you get the deck, feel it in your hands. There is like a real thing about sometimes I've gotten decks and there's no energy on them, even when I've used them. And I just don't overthink it. I just don't really use that. And then there's other decks that are very charged. The cards fly out. After I've shuffled them, it feels like there's more energy on them. So again, just try to embrace a different kind of operating system when you're in these divination practices. Like be playful about it. I think that's when everything changed for me, is like when I stopped being so Scorpio serious and I was like, I don't know, I'm shuffling, I'm feeling something, that's good enough for me. And always trusting yourself. I think when you start to defer too much and you kind of outsource your own intuition, it gets a little strange, and that can be part of your process and that's fine. But I think I try and, encourage folks to really listen to themselves, and there's no linear right path. So just like make it fun and playful, and if it starts to feel forced or scary or weird, just put it down. And even if you're having a blast on your astrology or tarot, I really do recommend taking breaks. I think that if you start to become overly dependent on these things, or like I've met people who are so obedient with transits that if there's like a bad transit, they might not go out. And that's everyone's choice. But I feel like just question when those practices start to become like deterministic. Mm-hmm. I think then, maybe take a break and know that it's always there for you, right? So those are some of the first things that come to mind. But yeah, the astrology podcast is great. And Channing Nicholas obviously has an app. There's so much great astrology happening right now. A TikTok astrology goes crazy hard. If you have like ADHD or, you're not really someone who likes going that deep, like there's Gen Z has like some incredible rigorous astrologers who make things very accessible. Tarot by Bronx is great. Trying to think of some others, but there's just so many great accessible readings and resources. Oh, and then will plug, this is kind of nerdy, but one of the many people that I love their relationship to tarot is Alejandro Jodorowsky.
Yes,
who was put onto tarot by Lenora Carrington. So that's okay. But he actually on YouTube, you can like look up his name, and he read people's tarot as part of a crowdfunding campaign for a film. So he basically like offered tarot readings as part of this like crowdfunding campaign. I forget if it was like,
that's really fun.
Yeah. And I'm not going to lie, like a lot of them made me cry. Like one of them is the question, they basically ask him a question. And one of the questions was like, why have I never found love before? And it was from a man who was like 60 or something. And he like he pulls out cards and then he like interprets them, and it's so gorgeous. And I think that's just like such a fun way to engage tarot if you're still not sure if you want to purchase a deck. Like watch someone else get a reading and see what that feels like, you know? So yeah, Alejandro Jodorowsky on YouTube. You can just type in tarot, and I think he just does such a great job at the like whole extemporaneous poetry. So that's another plug.
Right on. Hell yeah. Mike. November. Delta. Romeo. Hotel. Whiskey. Romeo. November. Golf. Tango. So is there anything that you would like to talk about that I haven't asked you about, or do you have any questions that you would like to ask me?
I think I have one thing that I prepared that I wanted to share, and then I do have questions for you if that's
Okay.
cool.
Right on. Yeah.
I always have questions.
Totally. Hell yeah.
So one of the things that I think that is talked about, but I don't hear it as talked about, is how the stars have also been a historical like map of freedom. And I think there's, examples like the drinking gourd, where it's kind of like the folklore that enslaved folks in the US use the Big Dipper as a point of reference so they wouldn't get lost escaping to the north into freedom. And so I think about the ways that the stars have played a very specific role as like a technology of freedom for people in terms of the original question of the show around like, how are the cosmos not just this like self-understanding modality, but also something else that's like for the collective. And one of the films that also blew me away was this Chilean film, Nostalgia de la Luz, that's by Patricio Guzman. And it's this incredible like multimedia documentary. I don't think I meant to say multimedia, but like kind of like interdisciplinary documentary looking at astronomy and the military dictatorship under Pinochet in Chile. And he shares about one of the camps where there was like 1,800 prisoners, and how one of the prisoners, Luis, was a doctor and amateur astronomer, and he helped the inmates build instruments to track the constellations in the desert where they were imprisoned. And when the prisoners would look at the sky, they felt completely free, even though their material reality was the opposite. And eventually the military banned the astronomy lessons because they were convinced that the prisoners were going to use their study of the constellations to plan their escape. Mm-hmm. And Guzman, the filmmaker, basically the whole film is about how as we converse with the stars, we find a way to preserve our inner freedom. And so I wanted to share those two examples of like kind of the folkloric traditions, but also like the literal and figurative ways that the cosmos are kind of this encoded map. And I think that that's super important to remember, that like this is not just a psychological diagnostic tool, but it's also something that in very real ways has been used to cultivate liberation. And the other thing that everyone in astrology is talking about is the example of Pluto in Aquarius, which it's entered Aquarius, and how the last time Pluto was in Aquarius was during the Haitian, French, and American Revolution in the 18th century. And so just inviting the ways that astrology has been and always will be a technology that is deeply invested in patterns at the collective and social level, and that these aren't just, mere tools of kind of like the Jungian psychology, which are equally as powerful. But I think it would be reductive to pretend that that's all it has ever been. So I just wanted to offer those kind of historical examples because I think it's helpful to be specific.
Thank you. Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much. Very cool.
And check out that film. It's actually, I think the whole thing's on YouTube, and the English is Nostalgia for the Light. It's incredible.
Okay, cool.
I want you specifically to see it because it's about science.
I'll check it out.
I'm like, you specifically, text me. So how for you, like, how does astrology factor in when your kind of background is science? Like, how does that, like, where do you sit with that practice now?
So it's kind of complicated for me. I've always sort of had a passing interest in it as somebody who's like a general spooky nerd or whatever. I hadn't gotten like into it until I was a couple of years ago doing some planetary work out of an old grimoire, kind of classic called Picatrix. And there's references in this thing where it's like this work that you're doing, your own nativity is going to have an effect on it, like how these planetary energies are interacting with you, like based on your nativity, is something that one should take into account when doing these operations. But there's not a whole lot of like information about how you're supposed to do that. So as the complete like rank amateur that I am, I took my birth chart and I started looking at it just as like a map. Like, okay, this is this map for this territory this, these energetic interactions, or however you want to talk about it. And I started sort of meditatively doing a practice sort of known as pathworking, a sort of like meditative thing where you're doing this sort of imagination work. It's kind of like a narrative base. So basically like visiting these places on the chart where these planets live. So for
Wow.
me, like Scorpio, I can go and talk to Mars and Saturn and Pluto over there. They're all over there and where Scorpio is.
I love that.
You know, if I want to go talk to Venus or Mercury, they're over there in Aquarius, right? The sun lives in Pisces for me, for instance. So like these are things that I've been exploring from a sort of like just intuitive, meditative way. I have had my chart read by a pretty like talented astrologer and sort of gotten into some of the tensions that are there and I've worked with ways to like kind of bring those things into balance in my own mundane life by kind of, you know, playing with how those energies interact with me. And so yeah, that's kind of my relationship with it now. I'm exploring this kind of, I'm calling it zodiacal path working.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, thank you. So
Love
it's something that I'm
Pisces.
just sort of like exploring, building out a little bit and offering it to some people in my community to see if they want to play around with it and stuff. And yeah, it's been fun.
Yeah, just just last night, people were asking about, or I don't know how we got on the subject of like one of the questions I keep getting lately that I think is really powerful is how do you work with difficult placements?
Mm.
And I want to do actually like a video on it because there's obviously not one answer, but I think it's really interesting. And I have a bunch of difficult placements, but one of them is Venus and Scorpio. And I was like personifying Venus. And I was like, yeah, I just imagine Venus being like, where am I? Like, I don't want to be like in a Martian territory. Like, I'm just really trying to chill and be cute. And then like, yeah, I just imagine like Venus as Hello Kitty. And like she's like in this very plutonic Martian swamp and is like, I'm not fucking with this.
I hate this.
Yeah, she's like, this is like my bow is all fucked up. And like, what's up with this swamp? Like the lotus flower thing isn't working for me. And like everyone was laughing because I think it helps people when you kind of are playful or like help personify. And I know that's different than path working, but I think just being like imaginative and also kind of visual, like giving people a visual, I think really helps connect people to what you're saying.
Yeah, and pathworking might not be quite the right word for me here too, because it's not necessarily like a path that leads from one place to the other, right? It's just sort of like a connection between you and this thing, and there is a lot of humor that comes up in this practice for me. Like Saturn looks a lot like, you know, the MacGyver guy when I go talk to him. I forget it's Richard Dean Anderson, but when he was young, like back when he was MacGyver, not him now. But so just like weird things like that, right? So I don't know why Saturn is MacGyver for me, but that's how it happens.
I really like that. I feel like there's so much. I forget I had a tweet once that was like, yeah, one of the things I was sharing was how I'm obsessed. Carl Sagan and I have very similar charts. He was a Taurus rising, Scorpio sun, and then I think he has Scorpio Mercury and maybe Venus too. But Carl Sagan wasn't a believer in astrology, but there was some petition against astrology that was circulating among scientists, and he refused to sign it. And he was like, yeah, I'm not a believer in astrology, but I'm not going to like actively denounce it because one thing that science and astrology share is that we're like trying to understand things that are like impossible to prove and they might take 100 years, right? Like we know that our scientific paradigm shifts based on new information. And I just loved, I was like tweeting one day that story. And then I was like, yeah, like not everything is about being sensible, you know, like and I said, at our best, humans aren't, right? Like at our best, we are kind of like poking fun and subverting. And I feel like I just will always love I love all the Carls, like Karl Marx, Carl Sagan, like I don't know what's up with the Carls, but
the gallery of Carls.
I love Carls. I like, and I live in the Bay and we call the fog Carls. I'm like, I don't know,
fun, okay.
Carl's a thing. But I just really appreciated the way that he modeled not being a believer, but like also being like, I'm not going to create a petition against it. You know, and I think sometimes I feel like we live in this time where there is kind of this black and white, like prescriptive relationship that we have to our values and our beliefs that makes me feel really claustrophobic. And I think that for me, these practices have, even with really like stubborn, fixed people in my life, has like cracked them wide open. And if nothing else, like that keeps me going because I'm like, some of my, you know, least suspecting friends have come around to it. Not saying that they believe, but they have found that these tools like really help them ask the questions. So for me, there's like nothing greater, like that is enough for me.
Okay, I love that. Well, this has been fantastic. I really appreciate it. Where can listeners find your work?
Yeah, so it's a wide release. You can find Stars and Stars with Issa wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, wherever. And yeah, it's a collaboration between Stitcher, SiriusXM, and Futuro Studios. Shout out to my whole team. Like, it's a reflection of a lot of folks' hard work and gifts. And so it releases every Tuesday. I don't know when this will air, but I'm so excited. The next episode is with the writer Gia Tolentino, and it's one of my favorites. But yeah, you can also look at isanaka, ISANAKA.com. That's my website where I have more of my private client work and offerings. And I'm Issa Naka on most social media platforms. And then you can follow Stars and Stars with Issa on Instagram. And I've been really telling people, like, because I'm early in the process, I love feedback. I love questions. So rate, review, share the show. I'm very accessible and available right now. So if there's something that you want to ask or want to let me know about the show, like I love to hear it. So you can do that via Instagram or any other way. And thank you so much for having me on the show. I really enjoy your mind, and your questions and curiosity were felt.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time. And I was hoping you wouldn't mind offering a couple of parting words for the listeners and I.
Parting words. I would love to share this quote from James Hillman, where he says, quote, "Mythologizing events and behavior does not lead to more vitality, to more certitude about what is. The revelation of myth within events confirms ambiguity. It does not settle it. Instead, we hover in puzzlement at the border where the true depths are." And it continues, but I really think that my final remarks are just to allow yourself to hover in puzzlement and to speak the language of mystery, of liminality, of confusion, to not fear the strange, to not fear your questions. And that these practices, if nothing else, are inviting us into alternate modes of knowing and being. And we so desperately need those right now. And I think for me specifically, I've been thinking about how we kind of villainize illegibility and anonymity, and there's kind of this privileging of visibility and voice and claiming and identity. And I think that these can be really amazing practices for inviting a complementary way of being in the world that embraces the unknown and the unknowability of science and ourselves. And if we use astrology well, I think it's less about stereotypes and presumption and more about actually unlearning and meeting each other in this third space where we can transform together. And so, yeah, it's all for me about alchemy and transformation, which is extremely on the nose for Scorpio. But those would be my parting words: is let it be, let the mystery work on you.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, this has been super fun. I really appreciate it. I hope you might be willing to come back sometime.
Yeah, thank you so much again. I'm so honored. And yeah, I listened to some episodes of the show, and everyone was very smart and engaging and fun. So
well, thank you. Thank you so much for checking
Wait, are
it
you
out.
really quick? Are you Scorpio rising? I know we're done, but.
Oh, no, I'm actually Libra rising. Libra moon, Libra rising.
Okay, because you said Scorpio and then you were saying Scorpio Saturn. Is that right?
Yeah, Saturn and Pluto and Mars. So that's fun. A lot of Scorpio stuff.
Libra, okay. I just like to know. I'm like, hold on, what's going on here? And Pisces sun.
Yes, Pisces sun. Two Libra moon, Libra rising. Aquarius Venus, Mercury Venus, Capricorn is...
Wait, Mercury is in what?
Venus.
Aquarius?
Oh, sorry. Mercury is in Aquarius, yes.
Okay,
and then I've got Jupiter and Capricorn.
Amazing. Yeah, I felt deep Aquarius vibes. So I was like, Mercury and Venus. There's two major ones. Okay. But you're a Libra rising, so your Aquarius Venus is your thing. That makes sense.
Okay.
We'll get it one day. I need to read for you.
I would love to get into that sometime. I would love to hear your thoughts about what's going on with my whole mess here. So
yeah, I was feeling it. I'm like, ooh. Okay. Well, thank you so much.
Well, thank you. This has been rad. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, thank you so much. Have a good rest of your day and
Yeah,
say
you
hi to the
too.
cats.
I sure will. Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Golf, Tango, Romeo, Tango, Romeo, Sierra, Victor. Behold, a perennial prestige, continual revelation, the destruction of birth, cutting through the skin of what is with the scalpel of what will be, the work of the sword of process and its attendant cup. I have made an object of power discovered in another world, and been the petty demiurge to land's burst of the mind. I have died, lived, and caught a glimpse of the elusive reflection of time, but none of it is as great as the mysteries contained in a single drop of ink. All right, thanks so much to Isa Nakazawa for joining me and for the very informative and awesome conversation. Check out the show notes for links to her Instagram, her podcast, Stars and Stars with Isa, and her website. I really like what she said about self-belief requiring collective action. That's really cool. We're going to be getting into some listener mail and shout-outs, including a short discussion about atheism, and, as promised, a talking fish. And I'll also let you know about some cool stuff we have planned for the Green Mushroom Project, which is an ongoing group magical project centered around fostering creativity and community and increasing individual agency, which we started back in 2020. It's been a very generative exercise that has branched out in a lot of different ways, and there are a lot of fun things to do and ways to interact with the magical current or energy field, or however you want to think about it, that we've created. I'm also really excited about a new experiment we're going to be working on concerning creating a consent-forward space in which to do more personal or intense group magical work, and to just study the magical properties of consent in general, which is very interesting. But first, let me take care of a quick bit of housekeeping here. If you like the show and you're into what we've got going on over here, you can support it on Patreon, which entitles you to receive a bibliomancy reading from me. Making this thing is a pretty wild amount of work, especially for just one intrepid podcaster, but it means a lot to me to be able to do it. Thank you so much to the people who are making it possible by giving on Patreon or buy me a coffee, and to the people who are supporting the show by spreading the word. Tell all of your friends, allies, and magical associates about the show, as well as everyone you meet at the goth nightclub you attend. You can also post about it on social media or write a positive review where that is possible. All of these things are super helpful, so thank you so much to everybody who is helping out by doing that. And yes, don't forget to smash the shit out of that like or follow or alarm or whatever button it is so that you can get updates when new episodes come out. You can find Lux Occult, Hello Void, and other merchandise available at Illumin Industries, which is my Etsy store. Items will be printed on demand using the most eco-friendly options I could find and shipped directly to you at pretty close to cost. So there's some fun stuff in there. Take a gander should you be inclined. Alright, some updates about the Green Mushroom Hypho Sigil project. Hypho means web, of course. Lots of fun and free activities planned here on the Green Machine Discord server. Frater Damiana is going to be hosting a chat about chemonosis and harm reduction tonight, as this comes out on the 19th of April, Bicycle Day, just in time also for 420. Hope everybody is having a fun and safe time. On April 26th, I'll be hosting a special Fungal Friday discussion about the ancient Greek hero and god of medicine, Asclepius, and the rites that were conducted in his temples. We'll talk a little bit about snakes and discuss how we think about and use healing magic in our own practices before conducting a healing ceremony in Asclepius's name. There's going to be some crafting components to this, so it should be fun. I'll be giving a presentation about Void House, an experiment that we are launching to create an inclusive, consent-forward magical space in which to do more personal or vulnerable work in person or online, and for providing educational materials about consent and influence. I'm going to be outlining the objectives and plans for that, and we're going to be talking about what all of that is going to look like. It's also going to be a great opportunity to get into some of the rationale and magical groundwork that went into starting the Green Mushroom Hypho Sigil project. Building out this new space is a good time to reflect back on some of that work and how it can be furthered, as well as to share with those who are interested about some of the big picture esoteric concepts and stuff from history that inspired some elements of the project. Come and share your thoughts about group magical work, inclusivity, consent in magical spaces, and more. On May 10th, Laura will be hosting a chat about building and maintaining relationships with spirits that I'm stoked about. And we always have all kinds of new things going on. In general, join us for our weekly Friday chats, our monthly rune study group, and 6 Ways book club hosted by Laura, as well as for 23 Bibliomancy, an experiment I've been organizing to discover the Green Mushroom Project scripture on the 23rd of every month. Well, at least for the next couple months until all 23 books are discovered. Participants bring the book that wants to participate, and we combine the 23rd line of the 23rd page into a new text, and we find the line order using dice, sort of like a giant cut-up. It's been a really fascinating experiment so far, and I'm really excited to see where it takes us with its final book. Also excited to be putting the finishing touches on a new Astral Temple meditation for the Green Mushroom Project, which some people from the Audiophilia experiment I conducted a while back have requested I provide. It's going to lead into a new area of the astral space, which has been created specifically for chilling and getting comfortable doing magic of a sexual or somatic nature. They've told me about some of what they would like to have in terms of the vibes and imagery, and I'm very stoked to be presenting that soon. The next iteration of the Audiophilia experiment will be one of the first projects to take place within the new context of Void House, and the space we created for this meditation offers some additional protection in terms of boundaries, consent, and safety to reflect that. Once that's all ready to go, I will put out a call for participants for the next round of Audiophilia, which involves using audio, ritual, and self-pleasure to dissolve internal barriers like shame and to press into new areas of agency. The first track for this project was released on Valentine's Day of this year. You can check that out on the Lux Occult YouTube or on my SoundCloud or Bandcamp at Luxa Strata, Luxastrata. Cheers! As always, much love and much love to everybody participating in the Green Mushroom Haifu Sigil Project, regardless of what that looks like for you in your practice. Alright, let's do listener mail and shoutouts. Alright, shout out to Miguel, who reached out with some thoughts about something one of my guests on the last episode said about atheism being a spiritual path, and that not quite sitting right with them. I'll paraphrase some of what Miguel has written here for you all. He says, I would consider atheism to be a description of personal beliefs rather than a spiritual path. More accurately, a description of lack of belief. The sort of knee-jerk reaction I had was frustration to hearing it, because I've heard this opinion before from super religious people that think that everything from football to having a favorite singer is a form of religion or spirituality. An atheist can be spiritual if they choose, but me being an atheist simply means I don't believe in gods or gods. So yeah, and I think that that's an interesting and important distinction there. So in response, I said, well, first of all, thank you so much for listening and for sharing these thoughts. I'm guessing that maybe you're not the only one that this could have snared, so I'm going to address it in this episode as I'm doing now. So I've heard it argued, and this is totally like splitting semantic hairs here, that agnosticism or being unsure or whatever about if there's God or gods is sort of the opposite of being super religious or being like a believer rather than being an atheist, because one feels sure about something in both of those cases. Like whether you believe in God or you are sure there's no God, you're still sort of like believing in something that can't necessarily be proven. And I'm guessing that's probably what was being referenced there, but I don't know. So for people like me who weren't raised with religion or like being in super like religious contexts and stuff, there can be some huge blind spots about how this type of language comes up in different communities and how it might hit in very different ways for different people. I know a lot of people who feel like being exposed to religion or spirituality in ways that they weren't into as kids or in the past has been a big source of trauma for them in their lives. And this wasn't something that I had to go through in a super direct way, and that's a privilege that I have, right? One of the things that privilege does is, just how it works, is that it causes blind spots. The whole Marie Antoinette let them eat cake thing is a great example of this, I would say. By the way, that was mistakenly attributed to her, if you're into history. Anyway, I just really appreciate the opportunity to consider things from this new perspective that I previously didn't have access to. So thank you so much, Miguel. It's super helpful to have this kind of thing pointed out. Appreciate it. Alright, as I mentioned earlier, swinging steel mace, fuck yeah. Shout out to Fourth Dimension Fitness. It's early in the year, but I'm already looking forward to the Doom Metal 108 this solstice. well, this winter solstice, check out Thursday night Steel Mace class. Come get swole with me on Jupiter Day. Fuck yeah. Shout out to Ray on Instagram. Stoked that you're finding the show helpful. Right on. All right, as promised, shout out to Justin. Here is a talking fish to go on my podcast. In 1835, Alexander Pushkin published The Tale of the Fisherman and the Fish. This is from Wikipedia. In Pushkin's poem, an old man and woman have been living poorly for many years. They have a small hut, and every day the man goes out to fish. One day he throws out his net and pulls out seaweed, 2 times in succession. But on the 3rd time he pulls out a golden fish. The fish pleads for its life, promising any wish in return. However, the old man is scared by the fact that the fish can speak. He nopes out and goes home, without asking for anything. When he tells his wife about what happened, she gets angry and tells him to go back out and ask the fish to fix their trow, or to get them a new trow. Better yet, theirs is broken. And the fish happily grants this small request. The next day, the wife asks for a new house, and the fish grants this also. Then things continue to escalate, and in succession, the wife asks for a palace, and to become a noble lady, and to become the ruler of her province, and then to become the Tsarina, and finally to become ruler of the sea and subjugate the golden fish completely to her boundless will. As the man goes back to ask for each item, the sea becomes more and more stormy, until at the last request, where the man can hardly hear himself think, when he asks his wife be made the ruler of the sea, the fish cures her greed by putting everything back the way it was before, including the broken trow. Alright, well thank you to Wikipedia, thank you to Justin, and also thank you to Alexander Pushkin for this little tale. I do believe I heard this in childhood, a classic. Alright, last but of course not least, thank you so much to Eric who gave this delightful response to a Spotify poll which I put out about what do you think of when you consider the void? Eric notes, I see nothing but potential. Fuck yeah. If you would like to send me thoughts, questions, comments, or suggestions for listener mail, you can reach me at luxoccultpod@gmail.com or on Instagram at luxoccultpod. Alright, I'm going to leave by sharing the Green Mushroom Project's statement of resistance, but first I wanted to revisit something that Issa Nakazawa said earlier in our conversation, because I think it really resonates in a lot of different ways, about a lot of amazing teachers that I've had. Issa said, a good teacher will help you walk yourself to your own power. I really love that. And when and where it's possible for us to do this for each other, this is a gift which is equally satisfying to give or receive. Fuck yeah. Remember to resist. Resist by maintaining sovereignty of the self. Resist by maintaining love of the self. Resist by maintaining fierce loyalty to love and pleasure. Resist with acts of radical kindness. Focus on the path to better times. Fuck yeah. Thank you so much to Issa Nakazawa for joining me, and to Kathy for sharing those eclipse thoughts. Thanks to all those who have assisted, both seen and unseen. And most of all, thanks so much to you for listening. This is Luxa Strata, reminding you to stay strong and stay fucking curious. Here is the remainder of the track that you've been hearing today. It's something I produced back in 2021 called Dynamo. Much love. Crowley wrote, with the wand createth he, with the cup preserveth he, with the dagger destroyeth he, with the coin redeemeth he. Is what we build created or discovered? Or are there vast and storied boundaries between these lands? Dreams constructed lucidly from bricks of story and song, in a place where all is reduced to a symbol of itself. Shapes with too many dimensions to carry back from the wilderness of these borderlands. Though we may have caught sight of the beast we stalk, let us not be consumed by this hunt, carving whales from soap to be dissolved in the currents of the years. Let us walk with upward gaze upon these paths, embracing fear as a brother, and wield our weapons wisely, carving out space to iterate. Romeo, November, Golf, Tango, Romeo, Tango, Romeo, Sierra, Victor, Bravo, Whiskey, November, Lima, Whiskey, Sierra, Foxtrot, Romeo, Whiskey, Lima, Whiskey, Lima,
What scares you?
Ghosts, aliens,
Monsters?
the occult, conspiracies.
Some of you like to be scared, and unearthing paranormalcy is for you.
Some of you try everything you can to avoid it. Unearthing paranormalcy is for you.
We take the topics that scare some, and we dig in to find the source, then present the history to make the paranormal a little more normal.
We also throw in a bit of comedy to shed a light on some of the darkness in the world.
So whether you're scared of bumps in the night, what's inside your own mind, or strange lights in the sky, we cover it all.
We dig in and present all that we find and try to come up with some logical
And not so logical.
reasons for the high strangeness happenings.
Sometimes we are scared of the things we don't understand, and the more we understand, the less we fear.
So find us, Unearthing Paranormalcy, on your favorite podcast app. And join us on Facebook, Instagram, and Discord at UMP Normalcy. And until next time.
Keep digging.